We are super excited to have the Wall Street Skinny bestie back on, Moshe Wanuno, who was one of our early interviewees. So if you are listening to us on the Wall Street Skinny podcast, you definitely need to go back and check out the episode we did with him all about how basically news moves the markets. But what we wanted to do today is basically try to educate people about the upcoming US election. And also, there are some gaps in understanding that Jen and I have. And so this is actually like kind of embarrassing, but I don't think I understood that the US was not like a popular vote, take the presidency country until Al Gore lost the election in what was that, 2000 or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
2000.
that was when I first learned that. And then
you're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
The person who becomes president isn't the person who gets the most votes in the country. You're like, no, not in America.
Yeah, shout out to Weston Public Schools for the shoddy U.S. geography and political education that we got. Social studies was like, let's just talk broad strokes.
But, and then on top of that, so I would love if you just sort of give our listeners, some of which are, again, based in the U.S., some of which are international, a lay of the land about just how the election works here. And then also, Jen and I were talking, and this is also very sad, that we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about just how it works at the state level as well. And, about how
big gaps in my knowledge there
impact things. Because when you're watching CNN as the election number or as the polling numbers come in, it's like this precinct is this and blah, blah, blah. And so how does that work? And also, are any states different? So that was a huge question. But Moshe, if you can start us off.
Let's begin with our first course here, the state of elections. So long story short, when America was founded, we were effectively the first modern democracy, right? You got to go back to like ancient Greece for democracy. So the founders are meeting in Philadelphia, and they're coming up with a system that no one else in the world has. Everyone has kings, and that's the way things work. So immediately there was a distrust. They're like, we're going to let the people decide who the president is going to be. That's crazy. But some of the founders are like, no, popular vote. People are going to vote on it. They're like, you can't trust people. So then the other folks,
like, have you met people?
Have you met people? And by the way, when we discuss people, we're not discussing women. We're not discussing black people. They're slaves in the country, right? So we're discussing white property owning men. Can you trust white property owning men who are rich to decide who the president's going to be? Ooh, I don't know. That seems a little crazy. So then you had another part of the founders who said, you know what? Congress should decide who the president's going to be. Like, no, that's not the concept here, folks. So they came with a hybrid. They're like, we're going to develop something called the Electoral College. So we're going to let men vote. And then the Electoral College, certain designees designated by state legislatures and, people who know what they're doing are going to decide who the president's going to be and make sure that the people made the right decision. That was the Electoral College. I mean, people say to me all the time, the Electoral College is here to protect rural versus city. I'm like, no. That was the Senate. Okay. The Senate was about not letting the House is based on population. The Senate is 2 senators for each state. That controls for rural versus urban, okay? The Electoral College has nothing to do with that. The Electoral College was distrust of the people and basically a compromise. Now, remember, when we're founded, there were no political parties. In fact, George Washington in his closing statement says, do not do parties. That is a bad idea. Well, John Adams, his vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, who are running in the next election in 1796, are like, oh, no, parties is what we do. We disagree fundamentally. George is like, oh, good grief. So the parties basically develop in our first real election, because George basically was George Washington. He could have been leader for life. Credit to him. He did not become king. People wanted to make him king, but he leaves after 2 terms, gives a farewell address, gives all these warnings. Do not make alliances abroad that get you into wars. Do not create parties. And everyone's like, thanks, George. We're good. We're going to do all that stuff. So we get an election, and then the parties start to select their electors for each state. So going back now 200 plus years, each state, the entire concept of the Electoral College, sort of a group of objective people to decide who the best president is going to be, that never ended up being the thing. The Electoral College became Democrats have, in Pennsylvania, 19 electors. Republicans have 19 electors. Based on how the vote goes in that state, those electors then get to vote for who their party decided on. So effectively, we have a popular vote, but split among the 50 states. So there's a popular vote in Pennsylvania, a popular vote in New York, a popular vote in Florida. That's effectively what we have. When you take the national popular vote, we don't count that. We add up each of the states based on a designated number of electors, which is equal to the number of representatives they have in the House. And that's the system. So effectively, what each of the candidates have to do now is do the math. How do I get to 270 electoral votes, 270? That gives me a majority. And so how do I add up my states? So already Kamala Harris starts with, I got California, I got New York, I got Massachusetts, I got some safe blue states. Same thing with Donald Trump. I got Alabama, I got North Dakota, states that are just not competitive politically. And so what our election comes down to is about 7 states, so the states you keep hearing about: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, right? Even in those states, what are we talking about? 40 counties that are relevant. So America we will all go through election night, and based on the certain areas, you're going to hear about the Maricopa County, Arizona,
yes.
Cobb County, Georgia, DeKalb County, Georgia, Wayne County, Michigan. A couple dozen counties will determine who is president based on the way we do our math. Does that make sense?
Yes. But I have one question, because again, you were talking about those counties. And the question that I have is it because those counties impact the total popular vote in that state?
Yes.
That's my understanding?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not
just
actually
wanted to clarify.
right. It's not actually like you won this many counties. Now, I will say caveat, asterisk, whenever you look at Nebraska and Maine on a map, you're like, whoa, they have a red dot or a blue dot, because those 2 states have decided to split their electoral votes based on the popular in the state and then how each congressional district votes, which is why there's one vote typically the Democrats can win in Nebraska, the Omaha district, which tends to be more swing, more liberal. And there's a more rural district in Maine that tends to go more red. So when they add up the votes, there is a scenario of a 269 Electoral College tie. I don't know if we want to go into that scenario. You might have seen it on Veep.
Yes.
If they tie, it goes to the House. The House then votes based on the rules designated 250 years ago, based on state delegations. There are more state delegations that are Republican than Democrat. So in a 269 electoral tie, depending on how those single districts go, Donald Trump is the president, and depending on how the Senate goes, Tim Walz is the vice president. But it's looking more and more. There is that scenario.
That would be hilarious.
I did not know about that except from Veep. And
Same.
That's amazing.
You want to nerd out?
That's how we're getting our education.
I don't think that that's going to happen, but it is possible.
Oh, God.
No, that was so helpful. And to be clear, Kristen's very gracious in asking that question. I was the dummy who was like, I had to, because I remember being like, I have to change my voter registration because I was in a county where it doesn't matter, and now I'm in a county where it does or whatever.
Well,
and that's for my local elections.
Well, that's the thing too. And something I want to
election.
remind everyone is we're so obsessed with who the president is. Well, who's running your school board is important. Who your local sheriff, if you vote for that, is important. Your mayor is important. Your city council is important. Your congressperson is important. So you might even look, you can type in your address and say, what congressional district am I in? And then you can see how that vote goes. You're like, oh, I'm in an 80-20 Republican or Democratic district. Like, what does it even matter? Oh, there's a competitive district near, and so you can look at the various races.
Yeah. Not buying additional properties just to have a little bit more of a sway. It seems a little extreme.
Yeah.
Okay, that was fabulous.
What is the current state of the election right now? Where are we?
So as we record this on Thursday, October 24th, with 12 days to go until Election Day, where are we? Those 7 states are super, super competitive. If you look at the polling averages, and I like to look at averages because individual polls could be outliers, but an average tends to give you a sense of all the polls seem to be going in a certain direction. What do they tell us? 1 point lead for Harris in Pennsylvania, 1 point lead for Trump in Michigan, 1 point lead for Trump in Georgia, a 2 point lead for Trump in Arizona, Nevada, basically even, slightly trending Trump. The point of all of that is each poll has a margin of error between 3 to 4 points. What does that tell you if there's a 1 point advantage? It's a tie. It can go either way. It's very interesting, sort of the one of the more famous prognosticators, election forecasters. And that's what they call themselves, by the way, election forecasters, like they're weather people, right? I'm forecasting the election. And we all know this, getting the weather. It could rain today. It could also not rain today, but bring an umbrella. And that's my advice on election night. Bring an umbrella, everybody. because it could rain for your candidate, or sorry, it could rain for the other candidate, or I guess that'd be the metaphor, or it could be sunny for you, right? And so I think 12 days out, the president is super slim. I think some people if you're looking at trend lines, there might be a slight advantage to Donald Trump right now. Based on where you see the early numbers going. It's still very early, and 2020 messed up our ability to really understand things because it was such a weird election, right? With all the mail-in voting and the avoiding of whatever, and there was a record number of turnout. And that's something to keep in mind too. 2016 was like 127 million-ish people voted. In 2020, almost 150 million people voted. So you had 23 million more people show up. So are we going to have a turnout scenario of 2016? Are we going to have a turnout scenario of 2020? That's the challenge for pollsters right now, is that when they do a poll, they have to try to predict who will show up to vote this year. So how many of all the young men right now that Trump is trying to get out there, how many of them are going to show up? What's the black vote going to be like? How many women are going to show up? This is the first post Roe v. Wade, Dobbs decision, presidential election. How much will that be a factor here? There have been some prizes at the state level in terms of the state referendum. They've all gone pro-choice. So you're looking at that. You're also looking at record gender divide right here. This is a really compelling stat. For a number of years, going back a couple decades here, you've had Democrats are the mommy party, Republicans are the daddy party. And it's been like a 5 to 8 point spread, men trending to Republicans, women trending to Democrats. This go around, we're looking at a 25-point spread right now between men and women.
Wow.
That's overall. If you look at Gen Z numbers, it's a 40-point spread between young men under 30 and young women under 30. Just like the young people used to all go in the Democratic direction, young men have completely moved off. And so that's going to make, that makes we're talking about a game of numbers here. Georgia was decided by 11,000 votes last time out of 2.5 million cast. Arizona, same thing, 12 to 14,000 votes. And I tell people this, Hillary Clinton is president, if not for 60,000 votes out of 130 million cast in 3 states. Donald Trump wins re-election, if not for 44,000 votes. Let's go around. So people forget how just close this thing is.
Yeah. Well, and it's crazy too, because from a popular vote standpoint, it wasn't that close. But then again, this whole Electoral College thing is obviously, it's the system we have.
And to your point, so we developed this system 250 years ago. There have been 4 elections where the popular vote victor has not been president. 2 of them happened in the last 25 years. In 2000, Al Gore won the popular. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular. And neither of them won the Electoral College.
Yeah. So, which is insane. But so you were talking about just the fact that there is this, I feel like, momentum towards Trump. And I think part of that does seem to be just the betting odds. And it's possible also because Jen and I are in kind of the financial space. And so a lot of the people that we follow or whatever are posting about the betting odds.
Talk to me about that. Lay that out, because I saw Mark Cuban, who's an investor in Polymarket, talking about this, and he's like, I would dismiss it. It's mainly foreign investors. How seriously are you guys taking the betting markets?
Not at all, to be honest, but the Treasury market seems to care, which is wildly perplexing. So I want to talk, I think we need to go back 10 steps and explain kind of the overall theory.
By the way, is this totally new? Did this exist in 2020 or 2016?
So Polymarket itself, I believe, is 4 years old, but I want to be really clear about these betting mechanisms. These are not unlike the CME and the New York Stock Exchange. These are not the tightly controlled, regulated futures markets that we all know and love. These are one-off small betting mechanisms that, by the way, bet on tons of things. They have been betting on tons of things for the entirety of their existence. The U.S. presidential election betting is what is front and center right now. So take Polymarket, which I think is kind of the most well-known one. Bloomberg did a decent article about them yesterday, I believe. And so they are estimating something like $2.2 billion in trading volume on the presidential election year to date.
$2.2 billion has been gambled on the election so far.
But hang on, Moshe. Think about this, okay? What's the total average trading volume daily in the U.S. Treasury market, right? Depending on how you measure it, if you're including bills and tips, it's anywhere between 93 billion a day and 2.7 trillion a day.
I appreciate the context. Yes.
Yeah, in terms of in terms of the overall size of this market, that trading volume over the course of, 10 months of the year is really not significant. But it's seeming to have an impact on the treasury market. And I want to explain kind of the theory behind that. So and you can help with this probably, but there is this speculation that because of some of what Donald Trump has said about his policies, whether it be not letting the Trump tax cuts expire, whether it be tariffs, that overall, theoretically, some of his policies would be inflationary. Inflation tends to be bad for bonds, right? We're talking about future cash flows that you are set to receive in the future, right? That money is worth less today if inflation goes up. So therefore, yields on bonds have to rise.
Which is ironic, I should say, because he's campaigning on bringing inflation down, but some of the policies that he's promising, conservative economists, have said that's going to increase inflation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think too, when we talk about inflation is such a catch-all term. Inflation can be such a granular thing, right? Are we talking wage inflation? Are we talking about commodity price inflation, right? Some of these things are not captured when we talk about like core CPI and core PCE, the economic indicators that the Fed looks at to determine their monetary policy. Those are very different from what we think about as inflation, right? I think about the prices of homes going up because I was a real estate agent, right? Like I think about my bill at the grocery store being $350 a week at Whole Foods, whatever it is, right? So when we talk about inflation, that's really confusing to a lot of people because that kind of inflation is not necessarily what the Fed is looking at when they're determining the path of monetary policy. And it's not necessarily what's being taken into account when we think of like, okay, what's the deflator here, or what's your inflation factor on calculating the value of your TIPS, right? Your Treasury inflation protected securities. So like the finance inflation can be very different from like the Main Street America inflation. That's a huge problem, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so that's kind of the theory behind it. So what's been happening is the Treasury market has been selling off, meaning yields are rising considerably. Prices down, yields up. And that has been theorized to be in response to a quote unquote whale placing bets in favor of Trump on these exchanges like
a whale
being
market. One person or a handful of people, we think.
Right. And these are crypto-based exchanges. And again, the key to these exchanges is you're not supposed to be able to trade on these exchanges if you are in the US for the most part. So it's like, okay, well, if it's not supposed to be US nationals and it's crypto-based, and also a whale being relative to the size of that market. There has been speculation that this whale who's placing bets to the tune of like 16 million or 25 million is Elon Musk, right? Yeah. If it's Elon, I don't mean to break bad news to you guys, but like 25 million for someone who's allegedly worth $260 billion. That's literally like Kristen and I gambling $20 on the Patriots game.
Like Starbucks on me today, guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like it's quite literally a rounding error and absolutely meaningless. And again, I have $44 billion
on Twitter just so he could like run X.
Right, which is like now worth 14 billion. But so I guess the question is, there's been a lot of focus here on these gambling markets. And effectively, it is impacting Wall Street. It looks like they're looking to that, even though here, like, there's no rhyme or reason to it, and we're literally talking about somebody or some buddies putting, $30-40 million of their own money and potentially impacting how Wall Street is looking at the potential election results here.
Which is insane to me, by the way, because, by the way, it may not be Elon. It could be Iran. It could be Russia. It could be nobody, right? These things like...
It could be one of us using a VPN, by the way.
Yeah. It's $25 million.
With my $25 million of crypto. Yeah, not happening. But so I just think that shows you how little conviction the markets have that they would that's even a theory, right? Maybe there's something... And by the way, when we always talk about like, oh, people are saying the Treasury market is responding to this. Spoiler alert, no one knows, okay? The Treasury market moves every day. And then 6 months later, we're like, actually, it was this big strategic pension fund rebalancing that nobody really understood except the one guy who saw the flow.
So I want to go back to the night of 2016, as it started to become clear that Trump was going to win and sort of surprising everyone. I remember like seeing the futures market. The market had not priced that in, so to speak. And I'd love for you guys to explain pricing in how the market, and I was like, oh my God, it's not, and then eventually the market stabilizes the next day or a couple days later, or whatever. But the market wasn't ready for it. And so a whole bunch of trades started happening. I remember being in the control room at CBS as we're about to call the election for Trump. And we're like, oh my God, the market's down 800 points off of this news. So Wall Street is like the rest of us. They're looking for answers. They're looking to understand what's going on, right?
Yes. It's so interesting you brought this up. So great book by Michael Lewis, Going Infinite. He talks about this trade that Sam Bankman-Fried did at Jane Street, which is a high frequency trading firm. And their worst trade of all time was in 2016. By the way, they basically they're printing like millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars every day. But in 2016, they had kind of almost like created what you see in like the 538 models or like the news desks, where they basically realized that they could get some of the election, not results, but like as they see things come in, they could basically predict who was going to win the election, and then put on like a $300 million trade. No, it was a bigger trade, but they were initially up like $300 million, because what they bet was, it seemed like leading up to the election, every time there was good news for Trump, the markets went down. And every time there was good news for Hillary, the markets went up. So they basically wanted to like essentially, I think, short the S&P if Donald Trump was going to win. So when they figured out that, okay, Donald Trump is going to win the election before it was announced, before anyone else had figured it out, they put on this massive trade. And turns out it actually had the opposite effect. So they ended up being like up $300 million. And if they turned that into a $300 million loss, it was basically, again, the worst trade in their history. And what they should have done, it should have been like a relative value trade, right? Like against the US versus other countries. But the point of this is that like nobody freaking knows. So yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. People, even again, these are like the smartest, like these are like the proverbial smartest guys in the room. And they got it so wrong. And I think that that's something, especially now where it feels like up is down and left is right. It used to be that I feel like Republicans were the responsible party. And now it's, if you believe some of these economists, they believe that Trump is going to add, I think it was like 3 times the national to the deficit that what Kamala was going to be. Or is that, I'm curious.
Yeah. So basically there's various scenarios put out for the Committee for a Responsible Budget, a nonpartisan group. They've done analyses of the 2 economic plans. And in particular, the big thing that's going to be coming up, and I think you mentioned it, is the 2017 Trump tax cuts, the $1.5 trillion tax cuts. And effectively they have 2 different plans. Obviously Congress is going to have to decide this, but if they could wave a wand and Congress cooperates, Trump wants to extend the tax cuts for everybody. Okay. And if you look at who benefited, everyone benefited for the most part. But if you make more than, I think more than $500,000, or especially if you make more than $1 million a year, you very much benefited from those tax cuts. Kamala Harris wants to extend the tax cuts only for people who make $400,000 and below. If you make more than $400,000, she doesn't want to extend it. So they did an analysis of like, well, if we don't have that much money coming into the government, what is that going to mean for the national debt?
Yep. Well,
there's a scenario where I guess sort of the major case for Kamala is she's going to increase the debt by $3.5 trillion. We're already at $34 trillion in debt in this country, $35 trillion. The number goes up every day. Trump, because he wants to extend the tax cuts completely, which means even less money is coming to the government, which means we got to borrow more money, has an $8 trillion increase in debt. And that's on top of the $6 to $7 trillion that he increased already during his presidency. There's great numbers, actually. If you look at until Bush in 2000, ultimately, by the way, Clinton was the last president who balanced the budget and had a surplus. Right. Since then, no. So
what budget?
What budget? So Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden have collectively increased the debt by about $30 trillion over 8 years of Bush, 8 years of Obama, 4 years of Trump. So sort of like they're now doing it, like Trump and Biden are doing it like in record speed in 4 years. So now the question going, moving ahead here is who's going to put us in more debt? Because no one is trying to be the responsible party. They say they're going to pay for it. Trump says he's going to pay for it with tariffs. Good luck. And Kamala says she's going to pay for it because Congress is going to increase taxes on the rich, and everyone's been saying, like, what Congress do you know that's going to be doing this for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also just, it was interesting because the Trump tax cuts in 2017 at the time, it was interesting. I mean, even like for corporations, like I used to teach these financial modeling workshops, and it would be like, cool. In the beginning, you were able to deduct like 100% of your CapEx. And then like over time it went down. Anyway, this is like getting a little too in the weeds, but it's interesting also how like, in order to balance the budget, because I've always been like, this is so stupid. You're going to temporarily cut the taxes and then it's going to go back up. Like this just seems like stupid policy, but they do a whole bunch of these things to like get it through in the first place because of how just our, you know, again, to your point, Congress never likes to actually pass things. They like to get through like reconciliation.
It's bad politics to increase taxes, even though we know we need more revenue. And at low interest rates for many, many years, like that past decade, borrowing was no issue. With higher interest rates, well, guess what? Do you know what the amount of interest the government now needs to pay on the money we take out? And so then you look at like the budget and people are like, oh my God, like that's a lot of money. I was like, all right, so this is the deal. We bring in about $6 trillion. We spend about $7 trillion every year. In recent years, we've been spending $8 or $9 trillion. And when you look at what we spend on, people are like, well, we should just, be smarter with what we're spending on. Well, half of that money goes to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, various military items, about $1 trillion for the Pentagon. The CIA budget is classified. God knows how much we spend on intelligence gathering globally. So effectively, of the $6 trillion we're spending every year, more than half of it's already locked away. Okay, you can't touch it. Almost 2/3 of it, because no one wants to be like, you know what we should do? Cut the military. Like that's not good politics. Increasing taxes, not good politics. So what are you left with? About $1 trillion to basically fund everything else that we're doing. And so then you break it apart. What's the Homeland Security budget? What's the State Department budget? What's the agriculture budget? What's the EPA budget, et cetera? And so you can like pick apart here and there, but you're really you're playing with like once you've put 80% of the pot away, there's not that much to cut. So then what do you got to do? Well, you can be more efficient with the IRS. That was a big thing for Democrats the past couple of years. Let's give them some funding to go after tax cheats. Well, you know what's really unpopular? Giving more money and resources to the IRS. So Republicans are like, look what Democrats are doing. They're making the IRS more powerful to go after you.
I have to say though, we needed to one time, there was a F up that our someone did with like a rollover, and we needed to get in touch with the IRS because we needed to like fix something. You cannot reach anybody there.
Well, that's the point. It has been good politics since Richard Nixon to cut the IRS budget. So they don't have people on the phone. They're using computers with MS-DOS from the 1980s. And so you have these huge issues. The IRS needs resources to, especially to go after these people who are like getting around hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in taxes. Right. And so but then the politics is, well, they're going to go after me, who makes, 80 grand a year. I was like, well, the IRS ain't going after you, and they don't care about you. There's no money in you. They want to go after people who will bring them money. And so the IRS is in dire need of more resources and reform, but it's bad politics the same way this other stuff is bad politics, the same way that we know Social Security is running out of money. By the way, Trump wants to cut Social Security taxes. Sounds great. That means even less money for Social Security, which means that we think it's going away into, going to run out of money in 2034. Now it's going to run out of money maybe in this decade. Well, what do we do about that? Do you raise the retirement age? Hell no. Do you raise taxes? Hell no. Do you cut benefits? Hell no. Well, those are your three levers to fix Social Security, a system that was built during FDR when people were dying at a much younger age. Now people are living in retirement for a couple decades. We run out of money. We're not having enough kids. I mean, we have huge existential challenges in this country, and neither of them are having a serious conversation about solutions, because guess what? The solutions are painful, and no one wants to, imply to voters that they're going to bring any pain.
Okay, well, that was all really big and sexy.
Sorry for my soapbox.
No, that was amazing. But I also, not to be a wet blanket, but it costs the government $1.1 trillion every year, and that amount is rising just to service its debt. So that's just the interest it's paying on that debt. That's 17% of total federal fiscal spending. That's just to pay interest on existing debt. That's no new borrowing. That's no new sexy CIA programs. That's just paying interest on your debt. That's paying your mortgage on your house, right? Like just to keep a roof over your head. Like I think they pushed the debt ceiling out to January 2025. So I think whoever gets into office, the first thing they're going to have to do is figure out the debt ceiling. Like that's going to be day one on the job.
It's going to be that new it's going to be the what they call the lame duck Congress. Between the election actions, going to figure it out. Yeah.
Oh God. One thing I did want to talk about is, this has felt like, I mean, the stakes of the 2016 election, 2020 election, and then 2024 election now. I mean, I feel like it's been just like everything's been amped up to 11, like every election cycle. But I feel like the rhetoric out of so many people, like you listen, and I really try to just listen to wide different views, even if I strongly disagree. Like I will listen to the All In podcast, which has very right-leaning people on it. Pivot, they're a little bit more left. Ezra Klein, a little bit more left. But yesterday I was listening to Ezra Klein, who's the New York Times, kind of talk about just like Trump's personality and like some of the dangers there. And then obviously Kelly came out and talked about some of the, that he's a fascist.
John Kelly, his former chief of staff, said, he sometimes praises Hitler.
Which is, a little alarming.
But without context, right? And you can see, and let me say this, right? Like, you can see a scenario where like Trump's like frustrated and he's like, oh, I wish I had da-da-da-da. Like, right. And like, and I think, there's some skepticism that like this newest stuff has come out 2 weeks before the election, that he's not, and so, sorry, but I'll let you continue.
No. I think, but like, so this is sort of one side. And then in the other, I heard Bill Ackman on a podcast. He's talking about all the reasons he supports Trump. And then there's another finance podcast where it's two really smart guys. And they're like, if Donald Trump gets in office, there'll be world peace. And I'm just like, what? Like people just have such wildly different takes on this. And I don't know. I feel like we are just all living in our little universes. And I'm curious, because again, one of the things that we love about you, Moshe, is you are a straight shooter and you don't have an agenda and you kind of just like call it like it is. A, like, are we going to all be okay? And then B, I mean, also, actually, my other question is, in 4 years, will Trump give up power?
Oof. I'm not ready to discuss 2028 yet. We're still getting through 2024. A couple things, it was remarkable when you ask voters the issues they care most about, right? When you add up economy plus cost of living, et cetera, that's number one. You got immigration is up there as well. Also up there in the top 3, top 4 in most polls is democracy, the future of democracy, threats to democracy. And what's remarkable about that is, depending on who you ask, who is the threat to democracy, they have very different views. So 17% of Americans say threat to democracy is a big issue for me. For Republicans, the Democrats are a threat to democracy. They don't like the imposition of free speech limits and kind of the push against. And you saw Zuckerberg, interestingly, come out a few weeks ago, right? Being like, like our bad in 2020. And during COVID for taking the government advice on a few items, including, by the way, the former Intel officials who said that the Hunter Biden stuff was Russian propaganda, when it turned out, no, that was Hunter Biden's actual laptop. And that's what he was doing with it while he was high on drugs. So, I think from the right, they're like, well, the left lies. The left is a threat to democracy. They were the ones who were like pushing us on vaccine mandates and yada, yada, yada. And then, of course, you have the left saying, well, Trump is like talking, like on a daily basis, like one of his arguments this week when he was like going against Obama, he's like, Kim Jong-un thought that Obama was a jerk. It's like, well, we're taking suddenly we agree with, like, it's just it's interesting that you're using him as an arbiter for who is a jerk and who's not a jerk, a man who starves his own people. Anyway, but the point being that for the left, they're freaked out by the rhetoric there and like the sort of like, cozying up with the people like Vladimir Putin and et cetera. For the right, they're like, listen, it takes a tough person to deal with a tough world. They take him seriously. He's unpredictable. And that works to our advantage here in America. And even, I imagine you guys watched a bit of Trump at the Chicago Economic Club. Being interviewed by the Bloomberg editor-in-chief, John McElroy.
No, but I'd love to take credit for being so, like, being so up to speed.
It is worth the watch.
Okay.
Like even I posted a few clips on our Instagram account on Mo News, so you can watch the 4 or 5 minute clips if you don't watch the whole thing. But I think you'd find it fascinating because it's like sort of traditional business reporter talking about economic impact. The room is full of really smart economic, and Trump is like, you guys are all dumb. You guys don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. And let me explain tariffs to you. And he's going in on the tariffs thing. And he's like, but the tariffs are going to do this. He's like 2,000% tariffs, 1,000%. I'm going to just use tariffs as a threat. And you see how Trump like a lot of these, it's sort of written as headlines. Trump's using as a negotiating tactic. It's art of the deal for him. He's not actually going to impose some of this stuff. He's using it as like, I'm going to put a 2,000% tariff on your stuff unless you don't build that factory in Mexico.
Yeah.
So a lot of this for him is a negotiation tactic. But getting to your question, are we going to be okay? America's about to turn 250 years old, okay?
Which is
in 2026.
Yeah.
So we're like a year and a half away from our birthday, our big 250. Are we going to be... I think we're going to be okay, okay? But and not, there are people who look at certain policies who are like, that's not going to be okay for me, right?
Right.
I think as a country, as a system, we're sick, right? Like our politics, sick, we're divisive. We have some issues. We're ill right now. I hope that we're at some point on the road to recovery here, but we're not doing great. I don't think the whole place falls apart, regardless of who's elected here, folks. I know that they make it life and death, and that's an unfortunate thing. There's interesting polling out going back to the 90s. They ask Americans, how big a deal is who president is to your life, right? How much does it impact? How important is it? In the 1990s, 20-something%, 22% of Americans said it's a really big deal. Do you know what that number is today?
Oh, God.
90.
Close. 70. 70% of Americans think, oh my God, who president is a huge deal, directly impacts my life. Guess what? They were right in the 90s. Okay. Yeah. There were so many other factors. We talked about local elections. We talked about, business, all these things. Look at all the innovation happening. It's not happening from the government. It's happening from the private sector.
I think that speaks to what it takes for us to be okay isn't to focus on who's in office, but to say, hey, listen, if you don't like who's in office, the strategy is not to burn the country down or hope that they fail. It's to hope that they succeed. And I think that that's what's been lost on so many people. It's, I don't like who's at the helm of this. I don't like this policy. I don't like this. Therefore, I want the country to fail to prove that they were wrong, right? It's cutting off your nose to spite your face. And I think if at the day-to-day person level, if we were all like, you know what, we're the ones who are in control of our future here, if we all band together and achieve unity, even if we've been divided on who the figurehead is at the top of our government structure, then that's I think, part of the cure for that sickness, as opposed to fixing the politics from the top down.
Yes. Amen to that, but at the same time, there are, deep concerns that each side has for the intentions of the other. Right.
Yeah.
And that speaks to what John Kelly was saying and some of these former generals coming out against Trump, saying his intentions, he's dictator light, he would like these sorts of powers. But then not lost on any of us is that government is a slow moving thing. Right.
Yeah.
You have Congress, you have layers, you have bureaucracy. It is very hard to accomplish major things, despite what the visionaries that, again, it's not his plan, but the conservatives at the Heritage Foundation who created Project 225 have a 900-page manual for dismantling government. But a lot of that requires Congress and a lot of effectively people cooperating. Well, in many cases, there will not be cooperation. There will be fights. There will be protests. There will be civil servants who are against certain things. I saw it said recently, the number of checks on power now, especially if Trump is to be reelected, between a lot of folks in the mainstream media, between Congress, the amount of scrutiny he's going to get and pushback he's going to get on every single thing that he does. So there's this, I like to tell folks, your worst case scenario, ain't likely going to happen, right? And the other side, the worst case scenario, people are Kamala Harris is going to hand over the reins to AOC and let the progressives run amok and we won't have gender in this country anymore. Anyway, these visions of darkness that each side is proposing the other will bring, not likely to happen because, ultimately there is just so many checks and so many shades of gray. And by the way, as Americans, most of whom fall somewhere in the middle, would not tolerate either of those scenarios.
Well, that's, I think, the thing that's so frustrating is in both cases, I feel both parties try to radicalize people, whether it's, take any issue. It's you become back when in 2016, when Trump was like, hey, we need a border wall. And it became this huge thing where it was like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that, blah, blah, blah. And now it's like, well, maybe we do need to have some slightly stricter, like.
Kamala Harris is touring the border wall. She's doing a photo op next to the wall.
But that's the thing. It's like you're like the person not on your team says something and it's the dumbest idea, burn it all down.
Yep.
And it goes both ways. It goes on the other side too. And it's like, Trump during the debate when he's like, they kill the baby in the 9th month. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? That's called murder. Because it's everything is so polarizing when it's like so many people actually are more or less in the center and are pretty reasonable. But I think a lot of people are just very uninformed about things. And then and I do think then politicians prey on that.
And we live in an era where compromise is not, while most of us want to compromise in Washington, it doesn't end up being good politics. We have like the burn it down wings of each party. Like that was sort of the Bernie Sanders appeal. And he almost won the primary twice in 2016 and 2020. And so you have that appeal on both sides, which is like burn it down, like let's start from scratch, as opposed to, the other side is a good idea. And that's something I think, even you would look at the last 4 years of Biden-Harris. There are a number of things that they kept from Trump, despite criticizing it, whether it's immigration, some of the tariffs on China. There have been various policies. They're like, you know what? We're going to keep that around. But God forbid they say, he did have a good idea on that, because it all feels like, you cannot give the other side a single inch, even though I think some people would appreciate folks being candid, being like, first of all, you're not going to get that from Trump. Trump's never going to say like Democrats are a good idea on something, but you might get that from the other side, and maybe that's a start.
Yeah. I mean, again, I was telling you before we hit play or before we started recording, I'm just so dreading like November 5th and election night and just the anxiety roller coaster that is heading for us. But
so I think I'm going to tell everyone right now, there's two scenarios for that night. Scenario one is that we don't know, that like we all stay up till 1 or 2 a.m. It's still too close in a bunch of these states. And it might take days, right? Because Pennsylvania, they have a law. They can't start organizing any of the earlier mail ballots till the election day. They're effectively handling 2 elections the same day. There's a whole bunch of politics associated with that. The Republicans in the state won't allow it unless they get some of their stuff. Arizona's slow counting. There's a whole bunch of issues where Nevada famously is like very slow counting. And so you have some issues there. Scenario one, it could be days. Remember, it wasn't until Saturday morning of Election Day in 2020 that they were able to kind of call it for Joe Biden. Scenario two is that there's a slight polling error one way or another, and we might know by like 1 a.m., like midnight or 1 a.m., because like a couple states will go in a certain direction. And if you really want to nerd out, there's a website called 270 to win, the number 270 to win. And you can literally like, okay, if I give Kamala Harris Michigan, but I give Trump Pennsylvania, like who gets to 27? And you look at scenarios and you could play with that on election night and have that open and start giving them the states. You're like, ooh, she needs to run a straight here, or he needs to run a straight here in order for there to be victory. So you might get a good sense. And then, of course, we'll watch the markets and see how the market. So I'm curious, from your perspective, who like, is there one candidate or another that the quote unquote markets prefer based on their policies?
No. And that's because I think there's such a disconnect between. Well, I think there's so little concrete information about what those policies actually look like. Yes. So it's really become an interpretation of, okay, reading tea leaves here. I think this looks like this, but like you said, right? If the tariffs are 1,000% or 2,000%, right? If I'm building any kind of model and the two inputs vary between 1,000% and 2,000%.
Oh, he also says 50% sometimes. He said the numbers don't matter. He said the numbers don't matter. Yeah.
So like math matters when pricing the value of assets, right? But I do think that what I think there is kind of this overall cycle that we've gotten into, whether it's like a trauma response from the markets to 2008. And it really is effectively just a shortening of the economic cycles. And I think what is important to think about, and Kristen, I know you wanted to talk about this a little bit, but when it comes to the markets that I watch, the fixed income markets and the equity markets, and in turn then kind of credit and all the mortgage markets and the follow-on products, when you think about what the president is or isn't going to do, and you think about, okay, well, how's that going to flow through to the economy? And are we going to be in a state of crisis or in a state of euphoria? Well, who really controls, or what is the biggest transmission mechanism of that through to the American people, us, and how does that play out in the markets? And so much of that is monetary policy. And if you think about what got us out of 2008, right, it was QE. And then it was QE2. And then it was QE3.
Just for my audience, I'm on news, quantitative easing.
Yes. So that's where rates effectively are cut to zero. When we had a massive crisis in the financial sector and in the mortgage markets, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, cut interest rates effectively to zero and expanded its balance sheet massively by buying securities. And so people talk about the Fed printing money. That's a very misunderstood thing that I want to be very clear on. The U.S. Treasury prints money. The Federal Reserve does not print money. What the Federal Reserve does is they buy U.S. Treasuries from investment banks, and they give them dollars in exchange that did not exist before. And that creation of money expands the money supply, right? And that's when we talk about the Fed printing dollars. Like, I just want to be very clear.
Putting money in the economy, which has an inflationary impact.
Exactly, which then prices. you go spend that money that it cost you basically nothing to get or borrow, and you go buy riskier assets with it. You go buy a house, you go buy S&Ps, you go buy whatever it may be. You go invest that in a new company and you go grow the economy, right? And so that mechanism got us out of the crisis of 2008. But anytime there was stress to the system or a little bit of panic, it would be an immediate knee-jerk response of, okay, we're going to do another round of quantitative easing, or we're going to expand the balance sheet, or we're going to cut rates again, or we're going to do something more stimulative, right? And those cycles got shorter and shorter and shorter. So if it took us a few years to come off the bottom from 2008 to call it 2011, 2012, when things really were on the upswing again, then the next round of any kind of stress to the system, that cycle shortened to call it 6 months. Then it shortened to 3 months. Now these cycles tend to play out in the markets in almost a weekend. When we saw the unwind of the yen carry trade earlier in August, when all of a sudden you had a huge down day for S&Ps.
The huge freak out that everyone was happening. Yeah.
Basically like the one day that S&Ps traded down massively. And by the way, it was a Sunday night. But so the one day we had that, it's like, oh, okay, well, the central bank will obviously step in and we'll all be fine if something's actually wrong. So, it was less than a week before that stress to the system played itself out. So I think that one of the things that we have to think about is, okay, it doesn't just matter what the president is doing and what their economic policies are, but how does central bank policy go hand in hand with or work against that? And I think that that's the thing that the markets, more broadly speaking, will be thinking about in terms of what's the tone at the Federal Reserve level. They are currently in a cutting cycle, meaning they are cutting rates. They cut rates by 50 basis points. And that was more than what the market was pricing in. When you talk about pricing in Moshe, there's a Fed funds futures market that actually shows us, right? So it's on a dollar price of 100, and 100 minus the rate is the dollar price on the contract. So if interest rates are at 5%, right, the contract's trading at 95. Okay. If that futures contract is trading at 96, it means that the market is pricing in that the Fed will cut to 4%. If that market's trading at 97, it's 3%, right? And then if it goes the other way, if the contract's trading at 94, it's expecting that the Fed is going to raise rates to 6%. Does that make sense? And so based on the price on those contracts, that's how you can see what the general sentiment and what the market is expecting. And so that's something else that many practitioners in the markets are going to be watching, is how those short end contracts give us a sense for what we're expecting for monetary policy on the follow as well, and to see if that shifts at all with the election, because that points to that bigger cycle of, again, quantitative easing, how stimulative is policy going to be, et cetera, et cetera.
And I also want to just make one other point, because it's funny, Jen and I have I was more of a corporate financy person, and I'm kind of learning in real time. Jen is our markets, fixed income expert. But something that I didn't understand, and we were talking about this, is just the idea, well, a couple things. Okay, so what is the Fed doing? And then how does it actually translate to you, an individual person? The Fed cut 50 basis points. Guess what happened to mortgages? The rates went up. So just because the Fed does something today, that doesn't necessarily mean, that it's going to flow to the individual person, because they only control the short end. They're controlling that overnight rate. But if you think about how mortgages are priced, again, as an individual who bought a house last year and has a high mortgage, I'd love to refi. the mortgage rates are impacted by more of like what's happening in the longer end of the curve. So the 10-year, which is based on expectations of inflation in the future, as well as like the additional spread, which is again based on like kind of like the volatility of interest rates. So
and that also reflects the riskiness of a borrower, right? So there's a credit spread component. Yes. And when you take out a US mortgage, as opposed to in other countries, you effectively are buying a call option. You are buying the right to prepay your mortgage at any point in time if rates rally. So if rates go down enough that all of a sudden it makes no sense for you to be paying 6% when market rates are at 4%, you're going to refinance your mortgage at no penalty. So you have to pay for that option. And that option, the price of that option is embedded in a higher rate over the life of your loan.
But getting to the bottom line here, does Wall Street care who the president's going to be? They care about.
Yes.
They do.
They do. They absolutely care. The question is it going to be a buy the rumor, sell the fact kind of thing? So, okay, treasuries have sold off so much, right? With this new rebalancing of the quote unquote odds. Again, whose odds these are, I think we can debate and question, right? But the treasury market is selling off as there is an increased perceived likelihood of a Trump win. You could see, if Trump were to win, you could see the market rally massively, because what if it's okay, all of a sudden he's going to be super stimulative to the economy, and to Kristen's point, say, okay, well, we're just going to go, the
tax does get extended. That's a lot of money out there, right? And there's some other, like policies, but at the same time, if Harris wins, could the market also rally, or do you see the market going in a different direction?
I think that absolutely could be the case, because it could be, okay, maybe this is an improved sentiment in the country, and people who had kept cash on the sidelines because they were really nervous about the outcome of the election. If Harris winning, I think that seems to be the base case that the markets have priced in. I could be wrong, but it could be, okay, now all that cash that was hesitant on the sidelines, that's going to get deployed into risky assets, and then it's S&Ps to the moon. Again, I don't know.
And one thing to keep in mind here is, like, we didn't even talk about Congress, but like right now it's looking like the Senate's going to go Republican. So in any scenario, like, there is and the House is super close. I was talking to some folks there yesterday, and it's like, it could be a 2-seat Democratic majority, it could be a 2-seat Republican majority. And that's going to take a couple weeks to figure itself out.
Yeah.
But you're, in all likelihood, I do not see a Republican straight, but that's possible. It's definitely not going to be a Democratic straight. That does not look possible based on the Senate right now. So then you're looking at split government, which typically slows things down and maintains the status quo.
Yeah, but I think that's actually, I forget where I was listening to it, but they were like, the main concern that I think Wall Street has is they do want split government, because, I mean, obviously
that it's status quo preservation.
Yeah.
But isn't that sad, by the way, that apparently what we want is a government that can't actually get anything done, because it's just, well, things will be easier and calmer?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like if you're, again, because you might align with some views on one thing with one candidate and be like, shit, I really hate this other thing, And so if there's a straight, I mean, again, back to the reproductive rights issue, the idea of a national abortion ban, I think, is terrifying to women. But like,
which, by the way, there might be some women who want
is
not happening.
Stuff on immigration.
It's not.
Right. Well, I hope so. Yeah.
So Republicans need 60 seats in the Senate for that to happen, and all 60 senators voting in that direction. Okay. So like, I just want to keep that stuff in mind, and that was the conversation that like Nikki Haley was having in the primary. She's like, it's not possible, guys. She was like going up against like Mike Pence and Tim Scott, who were like, national abortion ban. She's like, guys, will you be honest with America? Like, that's not a thing. Like, she goes, how Congress works. How the filibuster works. You need 60. So, and I tell the same thing. Democrats are freaking out about that. Like, they need 60. You need 60 senators to either codify Roe v. Wade. You need 60 senators plus your House plus the White House to do a national ban on abortion. Yeah. And even then, you're probably looking at a 15-week scenario. And even then, there.
Yeah.
No, but my point is that like it's it is extremely, extremely unlikely for that. Like, I don't know if the betting markets are betting on that, but like, I don't know that
that's a good question. I don't know if they are
a single
either.
dollar would be smart dollar would be put on that. Okay. Just saying here. So,
but that's, I mean, you just saw Kristen's reaction, right? That's an issue that's being used to mobilize voters massively. And you're saying like, it's not even on the table and it's not even a question.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that just for me, the idea of something like a 15-week ban is actually, I think, terrifying, mostly because the only people that I know who have had to get those types of abortions have been because of awful like news that they get at the 20-week ultrasound about fetal abnormalities. And I mean, it's devastating to like having been pregnant 3 times, thinking about people going through getting the worst news that they could ever imagine and then being like, cool, you get to now like continue a pregnancy to term. I think that's why I think women are scared about it, because like they know kind of the process of it. And Trump's like, oh, 15 weeks seems like a nice round number. So it's that, again, that it's like there's no
2,000%
reason to it.
15 weeks.
Yeah.
But the point being that understandably so, right? But I'm also here to say that like, do you know what it would take, like legislatively in terms of majorities?
Yeah,
for that
I think
to
that's just a really
happen,
important context to give to everything. And that's something that, again, when I say like, do you really want a government that can't do anything? I think that's an important nuance that like, okay, you want the extremes deadlocked out of, the ability to enforce an agenda, right? But it's like, okay, how do we empower the moderates in our world to get stuff done that tend to benefit, I think, the vast majority of Americans? And
one question I have, and we talked about like, the issues we have here, like Social Security running out of money, like, like huge, the debt. At what point, because the government's not going to police itself on this and never going to deal with it until it has to, do the markets basically create a situation where the government has to act? Or are the governments, are the markets like tolerating, like if we went into 50 trillion in debt, 80 trillion, like is there a certain number that we have to hit before like, like smart business people are like, this is not good. We do not want to become Japan.
We're there. We passed that point so long ago where the smart business people said, this is insane. It's funny. Kristen and I have a separate podcast where we are doing an episode by episode analysis of the HBO show Industry. And that show, the first episode aired in 2020. I think it was filmed in 2019. And the, crackerjack young analyst has this brilliant idea that China's going to start liquidating their U.S. Treasury holdings because fiscal spending in the U.S. is super out of control. Again, this show would have been written and filmed in 2019.
Right.
And therefore,
there's always been that fear because China holds a certain amount of our debt that they're at some point. Yeah.
But the whole thing comes back to, as long as the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world and we can print U.S. dollars to pay off our debts, right? Yes, we can talk about inflation spiraling out of control, but like if we are the reserve currency of the world and that doesn't change anytime soon. And by the way, China accepts U.S. dollars in payment for their goods. So what are they going to invest in with those U.S. dollars? They have to do something with those dollars. So as long as that dynamic still holds, and again, I'm just using China as an example, that's not, the only person we are who is the owner of
right, and
US
actually,
treasuries.
when you look at the numbers, it's sort of overdone. Like the Japanese own just as much debt, if not more debt, and most of the debt is not even foreign owned. When you look at
correct,
yeah,
correct. So especially when you've got treasuries yielding 5%, right? I mean, when you can park your money away and it's effectively risk free, right? Default risk free, not P&L risk free, but default risk free. Until those dynamics change, there's no one holding that, there's no one saying like, sorry, no mas, right? And you've kind of been wrong if you've taken the other side of that trade. Really at any point, it's just a question of, maybe make 50 basis points here and there, right?
I mean, look, so Jen and I, just again, to give extra context, if any of you guys don't know who we are, Jen started her career at Lehman Brothers in 2006. I started on the CDO desk at Morgan Stanley in 2007, which was basically like, where the whole global financial crisis kind of started product wise. And the thing is that I think that people had concerns about the housing market for a long time, like for years leading up to it. And it was like, there's going to be a crash. And obviously nothing happened. Everything was fine until it wasn't. It's like, and then the bottom fell out. And so I do think that, it's possible. It's fine until all of a sudden there's some trigger and then everything is obviously horrible. And then we're effed. So I am concerned about that like we think it's all fine, but like is there some catalyst that makes it not that case? I don't know.
But again, and not that case for how long and for whom and to what extent, right? So that's the thing. I mean, the options market, the entire volatility markets are predicated around the fact of like trading off fear, right? In a lot of ways, right? I want to spend a little bit to hedge against this outsized risk that I can't otherwise hedge in, right? I'm willing to pay that insurance premium effectively against these outcomes, right? And there is trillions and trillions of dollars in these both over-the-counter and exchange-traded options all over the world on every single product that you could imagine. Right. And so if you are ever buying options, right, it is because you are hedging some fear. And the kind of story of the last 15 years is that, you know, you pretty much make money by just selling vol every day and picking up pennies, right? You're picking up pennies in front of the steamroller. But if you pick up 15 years worth of pennies in front of the steamroller that only lasts 2 weeks, right? Because that's how short these cycles are, you know? And so that's I think the caveat is that people are always overly, they trade with that fear that tends to dominate, right? That recency bias. Kristen and I talked about 2008 like it was last week, okay? Because we were so scarred and traumatized by this thing that happened at the beginning of
But that's
our
the markets writ large. The markets, I mean, also like why they kept interest rates super low over the last decade, which like in retrospect was that, you know, a smart idea. 2020 COVID was sort of like, what are the lessons from '08? Like, how do we prevent a, you know, global wide, depression here with what's happening? So we pumped a whole bunch of money on there. And I think the numbers are 170 of the 190 countries in the world had inflation, forms of inflation, because of the amount of money we pumped in there. The US actually did slightly better than Europe and some other countries, though we like to complain about our inflation here, understandably so, given the cost of goods. And so that's where we're at. And so one of the questions, you know, I had for you guys is like, we're 2 years into a bull market. The average bull market I saw is about 5 years. Like, what are we not talking about right now when it comes to this next president, whether it's Harris or Trump? What are they going to be dealing with economically?
AI regulation. That's what we're not talking about, because so much of the bull market is driven by, like, when you talk about the bull market writ large as like, okay, everyone kind of uses the price of the S&P 500 as the proxy for that, right? So much of that bullishness is driven by the price of a handful of companies
NVIDIA.
that are all that are all very AI and tech centric, right? So AI regulation, how that evolves over the next 4 years is, I think, potentially the single most important metric that we need to be focused on in terms of the health of that as the proxy for the overall market. Because, by the way, there's a whole lot of companies out there that aren't AI, right? And it's like, okay, well, right now, right, like all the nuclear power is experiencing like a huge explosion, a huge run up, because it's like, oh, we're going to need more power to fuel the AI, right? There's all these knock-on effects that are clearly happening, right? And that are, again, part of this bull market move. The question is as AI regulation evolves, how is that going to impact growth in that sector? And how is that going to impact then all these other knock-on things that are unintended consequences of it? That's what I think we should be watching. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I will say, I think it's, kind of alarming that neither Kamala nor Trump are talking about just, again, then the impact of AI on people's jobs. And, you know, you saw in like 2016, one of the things that was, again, obviously terrible that Hillary said, and I think was, hurt her, was we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of business. Like, people don't want to be put out of business. People don't want to basically have their jobs disappear. And I think
you see the issue with Kamala Harris too, because in 2019 she said fracking, go away. Now she's I love fracking. What are you talking about?
And I will say, it drives me crazy. I'm like, can you just give a reason? There's so many good reasons you could give. Just give a reason.
Give me a reason as to why you flipped your views. And that's one of the critiques
and
of her.
I'm fine with people changing their minds.
Yeah,
I'm
just
totally
give a reason.
Fine. Yeah. But yeah,
we all change our minds. We change our minds when it comes to our lives, our finances, our kids. Like, oh, I learned new information.
Yeah,
the reality of the world changed. Just say it.
Yeah. But I do think that just even for anyone, right? I don't know if like you're sort of feeling this way. I know as, you know, Jen and I as like creators and educators, podcasters, like I do worry about, you know, what's AI just like being able to, recreate what we're doing. Like, and also it feels a little bit like steal our stuff. You know, it's like they're scraping the internet and then creating this thing that then they can go and use. I put a meme out where it was like Ariel in The Little Mermaid, and it's like Ursula's like, you know, sing, and it's basically whatever. But I am surprised.
That's exactly it. You know, you're seeing a handful of lawsuits, right? The New York Times and others who are like, you can't just take all my stuff, and then recreate me and customize me. Like I have. There's a lot of value there. You can't just. And so I think that there is. an attempt there. You saw the AI heads, right, in the spring before Congress who were like, regulate us. So we all play by the same rules. Yeah. And we're still not there.
But it's also, and on top of that, I mean, look, humans were highly adaptable. Like, we can figure out how to do something else. I mean, but it's also the time frame. So if it's like, we're not going to need, investment bankers and lawyers and accountants and all these things that, by the way, people are going to school and studying right now. And you're going to, so I think that that's one of the other things.
But if all of customer service goes away and goes to AI, that's a lot of jobs.
Yeah. And so I do think that they need to be talking about how they're going to protect people and workers in the meantime, because back in the day it was like, oh, well, the coal miners can just go into green energy and do something. It's like, no, they've learned how to do this thing and they've done this. I don't know for how many years. This is how they've been feeding their family. Like, yes, it's part of a global trend. We want to move away from it, but you can't just overnight be like, we're going to put all you guys out of business, because that's their job. That's what they know how to do. And it's the same thing now. And so that is, I don't know, for me, and also then the economic effects, because what do we look at? Jobs reports. So it's there's lots of jobs that are.
And do you guys trust the jobs reports? Because that's been a knock.
No, but
for the
to
past
be honest,
few years.
no. But that's the thing. For how long have people been like, the jobs report is rigged, or somebody had the number before it came out, or whatever? So it's
but more significantly, we've had this record low unemployment, but I hear more and more from people is it effectively capturing, especially the post-COVID entrepreneurial economy? Has the Bureau of Labor Statistics effectively adapted to kind of the modern
No, of course
job
not, because
story?
it only captures people who can file for unemployment insurance effectively. So Kristen and I are self-employed Instagram creators, for lack of a better term. I'd love to really overstate our...
Yeah.
Right, exactly. We're teachers, we're educators, blah, 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 blah. But I'm not going to go file for unemployment insurance if all of a sudden Instagram kicks us off, right? That's not going to happen. And so it's private household workers, things like that. That's never been captured in the numbers.
The gig
economy has never been captured in the numbers, and that has exploded. So I think it's really... Listen, and then there's the conspiracy theories about the data itself being manipulated to, skew one way for, miraculously we had this terrible jobs report right before the Fed cut rates. And then we had this gangbusters job report with all these massive upward revisions. Whoops, by the way, everything was fine all along. And you get the conspiracy theorists coming out of the woodwork. I have no inside info on the BLS, but as with everything, data needs to be taken with a grain of salt. That's only one input that the Federal Reserve considers. And that's only one input that should be considered in your overall investment thesis. And that's why the big moves after any number, you're probably supposed to fade anyways. Because it's did everything really just change? Or did you get one data point from last month that's going to be revised 3 months hence? So I don't know. I think that for us, it's funny. We got a delightful troll yesterday who was like, hate investment bankers, can't wait till AI replaces all of your jobs, right? Feel however you want about investment bankers, but I would challenge those of you out there who are rooting for AI to take anyone's job, right? I read a statistic somewhere that, a person making $1 million a year at whatever it is that they are doing effectively subsidizes and pays for the livelihood of something on average 25 other people as just and again, we can argue trickle down economists, blah, blah, blah.
Tell that to Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders, the millionaires and the billionaires.
Yeah. Yes. No comment. But it's why would you ever root for someone's job to be taken away, right? Mm-hmm. Why would you ever want that, just when thinking about how people live and need to make money, right? That nothing good comes from that, right? So AI as a tool to make our lives more efficient. I'm not going to lie. I had my very first encounter with generative AI the other night, and I was texting Kristen and I was like, okay, for the 3 months until the Terminator enslaves us, I am really going to enjoy using it, because I was able to create a graphic that
Which one are you using?
It was Adobe Express.
Okay.
And I was using it. I basically wanted to illustrate how duration works in a bond and how you weight the cash flows. And it gave me a diagram that defied the laws of physics, but I was like, well, I can have something animated to show it moving, so I'm good with that. But it did it in 8 seconds. And Kristen and I have worked with human editors who have taken 3 months and still delivered something that effectively read if you've ever seen, those birthday cake fails where it's just write happy birthday. Yeah. And that's what they actually write on the cake. That's pretty much been our experience with human editors over the last 3 months. So I was very impressed by it. But I was like, this isn't going to take the job of those human editors. I hope it enhances their job, and they can use this to make my life better. I will pay
as a
them
force
to
multiplier.
use
Like basically they don't need to hire 3 people. They'll have AI. And so there's a lot of functionality there. I mean, I've been messing around with AI. It's not great in terms of breaking news right now for, obvious reasons, because news websites are not letting them troll, basically get on the website. So there's, between the lawsuits, I think they cut a deal with the Wall Street Journal for $200 million for access to the archives there. But still, like minor things, like, I'm trying to, like, we do an on this day in history segment. So I'm just like, hey, just tell me what happened on this day. But then, like, I get in fights with like OpenAI because I was like, that didn't happen. They're like, yes, we're sorry, that didn't happen that day. I'm like, I'm asking for something very simple. Like, and so at the same time, there are like, efficiencies, like, I'm going to go give a speech. Like, what are like 10 things that you think this type of person would like to hear? And I was like, oh, that's a good point, AI. Like, thank you. It's like, as a research mechanism, I have a friend that now uses OpenAI or ChatGPT as the app in lieu of Google. And so basically it remembers everything you search for. It says, hey, and you're basically talking to ChatGPT, and it serves as like a second brain for you.
Yeah.
And so I think there's
but I don't love when I open Google now and it summarizes the things at the top because it's wrong.
It's summarized wrong. We were watching, we were at this conference.
Wait, I think that's a very important point, everybody. When you Google stuff and you get that AI summary at the top, it's still very shaky. It's sort of like Wikipedia 1999. Like that's where we're at.
No, it's really dangerous.
Yeah.
No, I looked up because we were at this conference and Serena Williams was giving a speech and she was talking about her daughters. And I was like, oh, how old are her daughters? So I look it up and it's like her daughter is 7 months old, born longer than 7 months ago. And I was like, do you have the date? And I mean, but yeah, they just like took it from a website, but it's like they're not applying any kind of critical thinking to it.
Yeah, I do things. I do speeches for like kids on media literacy. So I did like a high school this week in Westchester.
I saw that.
A junior high in Yonkers and have a bunch more lined up. And, for them, 14, 15, 16 years old, I was like, first thing, don't believe everything you see on the internet. Like, don't believe every TikTok you've seen. Like, if that seems weird to you or excites you or angers you, Google it. Like, Google's a thing too. And see if there's a website that like feels like it's legitimate that might also be reporting something similar. And I think everybody needs that grain of salt when it comes to AI stuff right now.
Yeah. One of the things that I also was listening to, and I was actually kind of alarmed by it, they were talking about just like how AI is going to be incorporated in education. And I have mixed feelings about it because I do think there is obviously something amazing about having it be used for tutors and stuff, but also like, I don't think I want my kids to be on screens and able to access this kind of tool because, I mean, I was talking to a good friend. She's 40 years old. She's like, I like use ChatGPT for all my emails. And she's like, but it's making me dumber. She's like, because I put it in, I have these amazing emails, but like, I can't write my own emails now. And I think for kids, it's really important for them to still learn how to do all the stuff because like you do have to communicate with other people. And so I am worried about having it, like we're talking about cell phones in schools, like having ChatGPT in education, like, oh, I don't know.
There's a navigation part of our brain for the first 300,000 years of human history until about 10 years ago. You had to remember you're going to walk down, you're going to make a left, and you're going to make a right, or like a mile down the road. Like I have a sense of what a mile is. Then you're going to like turn off there at the McDonald's, etc. You're going to remember directions. And then like, we remember there's an age of MapQuest where you typed out the directions, you printed them out, they were on a sheet of paper, etc. But you still, I was traveling to cover campaign politics in 2008. Like across Iowa and Florida and whatever. And like I had a map that Hertz gave me, right? Like a big paper map that I'd unfold on the dashboard being like, okay, I'll take Highway 75 and then whatever. We now live in an era where you could type in stuff into Google Maps or Waze and never have to like, you might take the route 50 times. And if I took away Google Maps, you would not know how to get there because
my husband uses the GPS every day to get to his office, which is 3 miles away. And I'm like, he's like, oh, I use it to, see traffic patterns and see, I'm like, there's 3 roads that get you there. Choose one. Okay. We're talking the delta of like 45 seconds in your morning commute. Like, I'm sorry, you just don't know the way.
Yeah.
But to your point about, kids and screens and AI, like you're going to lose. I mean, I even noticed this with my own handwriting, like, because I've been typing now for 20 years, like it's gotten terrible. Like I used to have better handwriting when I was 18 than I now have in my 40s. And so, brains are a muscle, like all these skills are you use a certain part of it. If you don't use it, you don't develop. In some cases,
this is what the Terminator wants. They want to turn you into a battery.
Like, imagine the GPS goes down for a week.
Oh no!
How will people get to where they need to go? Go do like a hedge bet on like Rand McNally maps, like for like a GPS outage at some point because due to a solar flare. Like, how is society going to function? It's good.
Yeah.
I get annoyed in New York when sometimes, I don't know what's causing it, but like Google Maps has me 2 blocks off. I'm like, Google,
yes,
like, what's going on?
Oh no, I used to do that. I'd get off the subway and I'd be like, where? Wait. Yeah. No, I used to always do that. And it was like really sad because in the old days, you'd have to think through. And it wasn't like an extra huge leap to be like, this train runs north to south. I went south. If I get out, I am now, you know what I mean? Like you should be able to orient yourself. But I'd just be like, why? Where am I? Like I'm going this way, but like, is it? And
my wife and I always have this fight on our Google Maps actually, because she always likes to, follow, a lot of people do this. I think it's the preference, like follow the direction of where you're going. And I lock in the map to north, south, east, west. So sometimes you're going sideways or whatever. And it's so annoys her. She's like, Mosh, fix the map. I'm like,
no, I'm with your wife. Mosh. No, I want the map fixed. I want to see myself turning different directions. If it's returning, then that's a mess. Okay.
Well, I'm an old schooler, and I was like, I just always want to know what due north is, and if I'm going like anyway. But that's an antiquated concept. Like no one would even under 30
kids don't know think like cardinal directions, right? They're not like north. They're like up, down, left, right, forward, back, right? Like, although in Manhattan, you kind of need to know north, south, east, west. Like, come on now.
Well, so she's right because east, west is a bus and north, south is a subway.
Which means I've never gone east-west, only north-south. I've been on a bus once. We literally did a podcast episode on like just how to survive in New York City. And we were like describing how the streets are laid out. Jen taught me that when I was.
And we got it wrong, by the way.
Oh yeah, we did.
Well, there's a fun history of that going back to Robert Moses. I don't know if anybody's like a deep reader here, but Robert Caro, the author, has a book about Robert Moses, who basically developed the modern grid system in New York and developed the FDR and the West Side Highway and the BQE and Jones Beach, etc. He actually had a plan to build east-west highways through Manhattan, 4 of them, destroying the village and basically to connect New Jersey to Long Island. Because as someone would know in the tri-state area, like going from Jersey to Long Island, you got to go through and he's like, we're going to build highways. And so then there was a movement. He would have destroyed Washington Square Park, like parts that are iconic today, but in the 50s and 60s, nobody had this sort of nostalgia for old construction. It was all the whole city, as far as he was concerned, was going to be Peter Cooper Village and Stuytown. Like it was all going to be these developments. And so ultimately he was stopped in the preservationist effort. There's actually a Supreme Court case that preserved Grand Central Station after the destruction of the old Penn Station, because you saw what they built. Now they've, now built a new Penn Station.
Moynihan
Hall, which is beautiful. But for like 50 years, we had that old Penn Station, which was garbage based on one of these beautiful. Anyway, there's a whole preservation effort. But if I don't remember how I got on this tangent. But the point being,
the grid and the evolution of it, which we did not know the history of.
New York is hard to commute across if you're trying to commute through it, et cetera, partially because there was a pushback at some point not to destroy parts
Speaking
of
local elections,
There you go. Yeah.
Tied it back in. This has like seriously been so much fun. Is there anything that I feel like either for your listeners or our listeners that like we should be watching out for, or just like paying attention to as we get into these final few weeks?
Listen, it now comes down to, if you're really interested in what's going to happen in the election, turnout. The old adage, when you talk to you interview coaches or players after a game, you're like, why do you think you guys lost? Why do you think you guys won? Who scored more points? Who scored less points? And points right now is votes. And so there are 2 schools of thoughts on how you get those votes. Your side, your hardcores need to turn out, and you try to win some folks in the middle. We're now at the point of the election where it's turning out your side. That's why you hear, a lot of questions about the turnout effort of on Kamala Harris' side. Enough black voters going to turn out, enough women going to turn out, et cetera. On Trump's side, evangelicals, are they turning out? Are rural voters turning out? Are men turning out for them? The big bet that they've bet this election. Then there's the fight among suburban women. what was called soccer moms back in the day. And there's been various, terms for them. What's the fight going to be there? That's where the race for the House is going to be. Because as much as, Trump can win certain states by really churning out rural or picking off 5 points among black voters in the urban community, a lot of swing districts, if women swing hard to Harris, which it appears, then I'm liking my chances if I'm, the House, Hakeem Jeffries, about being the next Speaker of the House. So ultimately, look at these early voting numbers, turnout numbers. Also keep in mind, people don't know anything because, again, this is sort of the second election ever with early voting. 2020 has a major asterisk, if not several next to it. So it's hard to gauge this election based on the last election. And so those will be the interesting trend lines to watch. And what crazy potential AI videos, photos turn up. Okay.
Please, let's.
People are like, oh my God, did you see what Harris said? I was like, did she actually say that? Has that been manipulated?
Wait, so you're getting those comments? You're getting people sending you AI videos of stuff?
No, I'm getting. I'm warning everyone against them.
Yeah.
Got it.
I'm saying if you already had your spidey sense up, going so far, this last 10 days. God knows what could be happening domestically, what dark money group is pushing something out, what stuff is being. I mean, this is what was ended up realizing later in 2016 what was happening on Facebook. It's not Facebook anymore. It's probably Instagram and TikTok, but just stuff like that. Because remember, this is a game of margins. We're talking about 10,000 votes here could make a difference in the state. Yeah. So if they can push something in Erie, Pennsylvania, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or Phoenix, Arizona.
With Elon Musk, where he was basically donating money to especially with the whole Israel-Palestine, people are very polarized about it, and was targeting Jewish communities, saying Kamala is pro-Palestine or whatever. It's
making it look like a Kamala ad. So Elon Musk funded a group that made an ad that said Kamala, I'm here to support Palestinians, and targeted specifically Jewish voters in Pennsylvania, and then he was making fake Kamala ads saying I love Israel and targeting Muslim and Arab voters in Michigan.
That feels like that should not be legal. I don't know. I know it is legal. You know what I mean? It's there's things that push that just feels
the boundaries of free speech.
Up.
Sure.
I will say this. I mean, hearing you talk about who needs to show up and all these things to sway different and identifying all these different groups, how politicians think of them and how they categorize them. Makes me so sad because we're all Americans. And I hate the idea that I fall in some bucket for someone of, she's a soccer mom or she's a whatever. And she's this race or whatever.
I look at you two, and if I was a political demographer and pick it okay, you're university educated women who are younger, I immediately, if I was at Kamala Harris headquarters, I'm I need those two. Yeah.
You'd be slicing
hardcores.
And dicing and reducing us, frankly, to things that I don't define myself by.
Yep.
Right? I don't define myself in any of those ways. I define myself as an American, and I love this country. And I really hope that when people are going out to vote, and I really hope everyone just votes. Just vote, please.
Vote, yeah.
Just vote, okay? If for no other reason than you were talking about the founding of this country and you and George are on a first name basis, but God, it's
I went to George Washington University, so I feel, I have a close relationship with GW. Yes.
But please just vote and think of yourself as an American and not as any of these subcategories first, right? Because that's what you are first as an American, I think. And I think that so many people lose sight of that in this election because it is so polarizing.
And because you're being told that the world is going to end and the country is going to end if the other side wins. And, to your question, Kristen, a half hour ago, are we going to be okay? We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay.
Yeah.
We're going to be okay. Yeah. We go through our bumps and starts here. People, and I always love the question, has it ever been this bad? I'm well, do you remember studying the Civil War?
Yeah.
Do you remember, there was a time in the 1940s where Franklin Roosevelt, who we revere as a president, put Japanese Americans in internment camps that we have apologized for, right? Yeah. We had Jim Crow laws, even with the end of slavery in 1865. We had, which by the way, in Texas doesn't happen until, a while later. It's just, when you look at our history, you're oh my God, that was continuing after the Civil War? Yes. Yeah. You had indentured servitude. You had Jim Crow laws. You had, huge people who are alive today who remember eras not so long ago where, we have our huge challenges, but we're an incredible country too. And so I think there are people who don't want to be reminded of our bad news. And there are people who just dwell on how terrible we've been as a country. Okay, guess what? All countries are imperfect. We're all trying to get better. Ultimately, if we can actually work together, we can continue to keep the advantage that we've had through both skill and luck as a country, right?
Yes. I want to just reemphasize that how freaking lucky are we to be living here? I mean,
that we can have this conversation.
Openly and not be afraid that we're going to be targeted. You know what I mean? You're allowed to, we have free speech. There's just, and you look at just the progress.
By the way, half of Earth doesn't have that.
Correct.
Okay?
Yeah.
80 something countries are now authoritarian. Of the 80 democracies, another 20 are sort of edging that way. We're super lucky. And if you look in terms of economic mobility in a society, even countries that we look at because they have incredible education systems and social and health systems like in Europe, etc., you can't come to one of those countries as an immigrant and then own a home and then have your kid become. I mean, even look at the story of Kamala Harris, right? Both of her parents are immigrants, whether she wins or not, what you feel about her opinions or not. The fact that we are in America where both her parents came here as immigrants and their daughter got a law degree, became a prosecutor, DA, AG, vice president of the United States, and has an even chance of becoming president. That's not possible in any other country on earth that has this many opportunities. And we should not take that for granted,
I love that.
No. So well said.
We'll end there.
We'll end there. Well, thank you so much, Moshe. As always, we love talking to you. And I guess we will, if you are on our podcast, leave us a written 5-star review. And we will see you next time.
Yeah, and everyone who's listening to us, follow Moshe at you have 2 tags, right? So you've got your open account and you've got your additional
I have a premium
right?
account. So at Moshe at MOSHEH, you can search for Mo News, MO News, and we have our daily podcast, our interview podcast, we have our daily newsletter, we have the Instagram account, and then you can join Mo News Premium where I answer your questions. And this conversation, this is sort of a taste of that. We give you the down low over there. And for anyone listening here on Mo News, follow at Wall Street Skinny.
At the Wall Street Skinny. The definite article is very important. And we do none of that. So we don't have a daily newsletter. We don't whatever. No, we do educational content about how to land and thrive in the world's highest paying careers. We have a weekly podcast. We have a midweek episode. And then we have a second podcast where we are breaking down the show industry. We also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And we started rolling out self-paced courses for people who want to get up the learning curve to understand how the financial services industry actually works.
I highly recommend it. I love how you guys break stuff down.
Thank you.
And your videos give me a chuckle. Good
and,
sense of humor.
Vice versa. Obviously, this is not at all sponsored, but we are Mo News Premium members. We love it. And so definitely subscribe.
It's worth every penny.